Welcome to the City Current Radio Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. We're always honored to bring you important content that you can use for your business, your nonprofit. We're helping you power the good in a lot of ways. And with that, we're diving into cyber liability, cyber risk management. We're here with Holden. He's a managing director and management liability practice leader with Higginbotham. How are you doing, Gray?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me this afternoon.
Hey, this topic is hot. It's something that unfortunately we're seeing so much growth in terms of ransomware and cyber liability and risk. And so let's dive in a little bit to your world. When you talk about cyber liability, cyber risk, how do you define kind of the world that you play in on your end, helping businesses and organizations manage that?
Certainly. So what we are working with is really a team of people. Obviously, we have the client and their internal IT, security infrastructure and their IT teams. But typically, those folks are going to have some sort of outsourced function with an IT service provider and possibly security consultants as well. How we kind of close the loop on that risk management circle, if you will, is on the insurance or risk management risk transfer side. They need to do all the good things that they can do on the front end to avoid the risk or mitigate the risk, and then on the back end, we're providing solutions to help them transfer risk in the event they do have a problem.
And so there is very specific insurance that you can get that helps with the cyber liability and the cyber risk management. Talk about kind of what that means, unfold it a little bit when it comes to the insurance options.
Sure. So most of your commercial insurance policies over the last decade have begun to specifically exclude IT risk and cyber risk. Data breach risk is another definition or term for it. And so what's developed is a standalone product, if you will, that's called cyber liability. Some carriers call it cyber risk insurance. And there's really two features. You've got a first-party coverage feature and a third-party coverage feature. That first-party coverage feature is going to protect our clients' systems, software, business interruption, and potential fines and penalties or anything like that they have involving a data breach. And that's a very broad term, but I'm sure we'll talk a little more about that. The third-party liability really stems from the initial first-party exposure, but what happens is if someone gets into their systems and starts creating problems, now the company has an obligation to protect the third party's data that they housed in their network that got released or got compromised. And so the policies that we have structured will protect both ends of that, and will also provide, some risk management control support services behind the scenes, as well as some crisis response. So a lot of the questions we get from people as to their interest in this particular program is, I don't have any idea what to do if I get breached, right? So we now, have a 1-800 number to call a crisis response team, get the IT professionals on the recovery side involved, and do some forensic analysis and those types of things.
When you're sitting down and kind of assessing where they are in the moment and starting to look at options, you gave a presentation recently that was really fascinating to me, and you kind of talked about this, but it's very few questions on the front end that they want to know because they can leverage AI and do a lot of research on their end. So talk about that first process and those first steps of looking at just kind of where they are.
Certainly. So the underwriting community has evolved tremendously just in the last 2 or 3 years. And these products have been out there for almost 20 years, but they really haven't evolved until the last decade or so. And specifically on the underwriting side, what the underwriters have started doing is having IT professionals come in and actually use their expertise to underwrite, as opposed to using insurance professionals to try to understand and underwrite IT risk. And with that, we've had a couple of really interesting markets emerge here just in the last 12 months that are using artificial intelligence to, automatically underwrite, if you will. And so the basic information we need is the company's name, their main website addresses, if they have multiple, their corporate address, and a rough number of employees and general idea of their annual revenues. Those are the basic rating factors that go into the initial indications. The underwriting company then actually tries to go out and ping the public sites and see what they can find as far as weaknesses. Then they come back with a score, and that score is on a scale of 0 to 100, and that the closer to 100, the better the rating is going to be. And if it's below a certain amount, usually in that 50 to 60 range, they're probably not going to get a quote. There are going to be some contingencies on asking additional questions to clarify what security is in place.
Part of the presentation that you gave to the chamber included a lot of trends and data around, especially ransomware, how the dollars are continuing to go up. Give us a little bit of a highlight from that presentation in terms of just the trends that sadly are going up when it comes to the proliferation of these sort of attacks.
Sure. So 5 to 10 years ago, the biggest risk was data breach and the breach response requirements that are very different in almost every state. At every level, you're going to be required to do different things with the individual's data that was breached. That risk has moved away. That hasn't gone away, but the overall risk and frequency has moved away from that to more of the ransomware, or what we're calling social engineering or cyber crime today, where we're getting fraudulent instructions to transfer money and those types of things with email shadowing and some pretty sophisticated criminals, actually. What we're seeing from a severity perspective is those are now not only a frequency problem, but the ransomware is a good example. We saw the averages of those numbers somewhere, in the big picture, 150,000 to 175,000 over the last couple of years. Well, at the end of 2020, that's jumped up to 225,000. So think about all the ransomware events that are taking place. We're getting some pretty severe losses there to take that number that high that quickly. From the phishing schemes and the email shadowing schemes, the social engineering, if you will, creating those fraudulent transfers, a lot of times people were trying to get under the curtain with a $5,000 or a $10,000 transfer. We're starting to see, $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 transfers pretty regularly. In fact, I saw one just the other day that was over 500,000, which is a little concerning because some of the policy limits haven't caught up with that yet. That type of exposure is often sublimited in these policies, but we are seeing in those two specific areas, both the frequency and the severity grow at a pretty rapid pace.
Obviously, don't name company names, especially client names, but give us an idea of maybe one or two recent issues that you've had to deal with.
Sure. So the one I just referenced, that was over $500,000. That happened to be a fictitious vendor account or fictitious vendor wire transfer instruction. So there was a situation where there was a valid vendor. The client got some services from that vendor, owed the money, and somewhere along the way, there was an email shadow that had taken place, and there was a new email that came out from the individual who had the authority to send those instructions within the company to the third-party payor, and the payor changed the wire transfer instructions and sent the money offshore unknowingly. And so that's one that was $500 and something thousand at a click of a button. Other ones that we see are probably very similar to that, just on a smaller scale. And then, of course, the ransomware attacks, the two most notable ones of recent past were the Cardinal Pipeline, and I don't remember the exact name of the beef company in South America. That, those were pretty significant business interruption claims where it not only was there a ransom demand, but the systems were shut down for a period of time that restricted cash flow and their ability to do business. So, you had a kind of a dual loss there. And today, now the argument is, okay, on ransomware, do we go ahead and pay the ransom, or do we fight against it and try to avoid and recover our old systems and those types of things to avoid the ransom payments?
Talk on your end about the types of businesses that get affected, because I think this is something that people, it's not going to happen to me. It's, I can push it away. But when you look at the businesses and organizations that are being targeted, it might not be what you think.
You're right. And going back to some of the trend information that we shared with the chamber a week or so ago, typically people would think of financial institutions, healthcare, and retail stores who have a lot of credit card transactions being those most at risk or the most frequently, targeted for claims. And in fact, those are in the lower third of all potential claims that we're seeing over a 9-year period. The top three, I believe, were financial services. So things like our business, financial consulting, wealth management and planning, insurance services, those types of things, and then other general service industries. Manufacturing was second, and construction was a close third.
When you look at a claim issue, like you kind of mentioned before, walk us through how that starts to unfold and the first step that a company needs to take. So as soon as they find out, oh, wow, we've had an issue, what's the process to put it in play to start getting recovery?
Certainly. So hopefully they have either IT security professionals on a third-party consulting basis and or an insurance program. In those cases, if they have those in place, the first call is going to be to your security consultants and your insurance policy, so that they can, get in there with the forensic analysts and figure out what happened, when it happened, who was affected, and what information was affected. If you don't have those services, you're going to have to rely on your internal IT team. And then in both cases, you certainly need to contact the authorities. In many cases, that rolls up from the local authorities to a federal level, depending on the size.
And you mentioned with the ransom, the insurance company and the carrier becomes a part of that conversation too, correct?
That is correct. So most of the policies today still provide coverage for the ransom payments, if that's deemed a necessary solution to getting that claim fixed. The challenges we're starting to see, and they're actually just in the last week have been a couple of carriers come out and indicate that they were not going to pay ransom in certain territories like France, where I think there's some regulatory restrictions on those types of payments. And then the analysis really comes down to whether or not to pay the demand as to how much comfort we have with the backups that we had in place. How recent was that backup, and how quickly can we track back to a backup that wasn't compromised, shut our systems down for that period of time, and then recover back to that, say, 30 or 45 days ago when the malware or other infiltration wasn't in our systems, to get our systems back up and running. Where I've seen companies not pay the ransom and be successful at getting their business back online, that was the situation they had and the systems they had in place. Typically, where the ransom is paid is something where they are in a pinch between not knowing exactly what recovery methods they have and needing to get their business back online. But really, the problems we're seeing with that are a lot along the lines of, number one, you don't have a guarantee that the criminal is going to let your systems free. Number two, we expect that most of that data may already have been submitted or sold out on the dark web. And then number three, if there's a promise to destroy the data, there's no way to confirm that that data was restored. So it can be used against you again in the future.
Yeah. You're in kind of a lose-lose situation, unfortunately, in that case. Mm-hmm. Which leads me to recommendations. So what are some recommendations, some bits of advice on your end, some tips?
Sure. Well, I think most companies are aware these days from an IT security perspective that this is a very, very important role within the company. And it doesn't stop with your IT professionals. It's got to be something at the higher levels of the company that the senior leadership and the board members are aware of. Secondly, most middle-sized to larger companies probably have experience already working with an outside consultant on their IT security. If they don't, would certainly recommend that they explore that. And then lastly, taking an inventory internally of what systems do we have, what legacy systems might we have that might still have exposures like open ports or other access where things that we were developing a website, for example, that's been shelved. Well, those things need to be tied down in the electronic world to avoid infiltration into the networks. And so, the services and resources within the internal IT structure, number one, external consulting, number two, and then number three, taking that inventory of what we have today and where we might have some security vulnerabilities.
Well, it's always good to know an expert and to have an advocate. So where do we go to reach out on your end to learn more and to start taking some next steps?
Well, we do have Higginbotham.net has several resources out there for this type of coverage. You can reach me at gholden@higginbotham.net. or my mobile number, which is the easiest way to reach me, is 405-406-6145. And we're happy to have conversations with anybody along the lines of, what do we have today and what might we need?
Yeah, and I think just knowing that you have someone who specializes in this area, and this area is constantly evolving and changing, just like we're talking about. And so someone who's got their eye and their pulse to it and can constantly help manage that process is extremely important. So, Gray, thank you for all you do. Thank you for the team and for being a part of the show. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.